A single metal could decide an empire's future. The real wars back then weren't always about swords. They were about the search for things that were rare. Things that were precious. We're going to look at those hidden wars, the ones started by what the ancient world needed, things like tin to make bronze for armies. Or incense, sacred incense, that was worth more than gold, and by the end, you'll see the whole map of human conflict differently. You'll see the deep roots of power. The ones that still shape things now. What launched 1,000 ships, if not a famous face? Why would a civilization salt the earth of a rival it had beaten? The answers aren't in the simple stories, not the ones about heroes and gods. They're in a scramble, an ancient, relentless scramble for materials, materials everyone needed and no one could easily find. What forgotten resource do you think secretly built the world you know? The Golden Fleece wasn't just a trophy. It was a symbol of kingship, a source of wealth, and it drew conflict. In the ancient world, a precious resource and a divine artifact were often the same thing. A rare material was a token from the gods, a piece of their power here on earth. If you possessed it, you held their favor. If you lacked it, it felt like a curse. And this belief didn't just describe the world, it shaped how societies fought for it. Historians like Adrian Mayer note that myths explain the origins of things like amber or tin. These materials came from the edges of the world, from remote places guarded by monsters. So acquiring them wasn't trade, it was a heroic quest, a divinely sanctioned mission. Think of Gilgamesh. A central part of his journey is going to a distant cedar forest to cut down its sacred trees. But this isn't logging. The forest is protected by a guardian, the demigod Humbaba, placed there by the gods. Gilgamesh taking the wood is an epic battle against divine will, a necessary violence to bring a godly resource back to his people. This framework gave legitimacy to what we'd call resource extraction. It turned conquest into a sacred duty. A merchant's caravan became a hero's journey. If you believe the gods planted a certain metal in a mountain, or that a tree is sacred to a deity, then taking it isn't theft, it's fulfilling a cosmic order. It answers a question: how much of ancient warfare was driven by controlling the gods' own currency? The battles weren't just for land or slaves. They were for the substances that connected humanity to the divine. That mindset is the first key. It sets the stage for understanding why the search for a single, mundane material could ignite conflicts for centuries. That belief in divine resources made one metal matter more than anything else. The whole Bronze Age was named for it, but the key ingredient was almost a ghost. Copper was common, you could find it in many places, but tin, the metal that turns soft copper into hard, weapon-grade bronze, that was incredibly rare. To find it, you had to look to the very edges of the known world, distant places, Cornwall in Britain, the mountains of Afghanistan. So any civilization that wanted an army, that wanted tools, that wanted to survive, was suddenly dependent on a supply chain thousands of miles long. A single trade route became the artery of an empire, and if that artery was cut, the whole body could fail. So the search for tin wasn't just commerce. It was a matter of national security. The great powers, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians, they all needed this one thing they couldn't make themselves. That created a world of tense diplomacy, of guarded secrets, and of inevitable conflict. Control the tin, and you control who gets bronze. Control who gets bronze, and you control who gets an army. It's a simple equation, a brutal one. Historians now look at legendary conflicts like the Trojan War, and they see more than a story about a queen. They see the geography. Troy sat at a crucial gateway. It controlled access from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. Some of the ancient world's most important tin routes passed right through there. So the real prize, maybe it wasn't Helen, maybe it was a monopoly on the metal that built civilizations. The archaeological record gives us a snapshot of this. The Uluburun shipwreck, a vessel that sank off Turkey over 3,000 years ago. It was a floating treasure chest. It carried gold, ivory, glass. And nestled among those luxuries were 10 tons of copper ingots and 1 ton of tin ingots, the perfect ratio for making bronze. This wasn't a casual merchant ship. This was a state-sponsored mission carrying the very lifeblood of military power. Losing a ship like that would have been a catastrophe, a geopolitical one. This dependency made the whole system fragile. When those long, delicate supply lines were disrupted, everything could unravel. Scholars point to the era of the so-called Sea Peoples. A time of great upheaval, collapsed empires around 1200 B.C. What if these invasions weren't just random attacks? What if they were, in part, the desperate movements of societies whose access to tin had suddenly been cut off? The collapse of a single mining region, the capture of a key port that could trigger a cascade of conflict as powers scrambled to find a new source. Or seize one from a neighbor. The quest for tin shows us the first true global conflict, born from a technological need. It set a pattern, one we'd see again and again. A world connected not by ideas first, but by necessity. A network of tension woven from the simple, universal need for a better blade. That fragile network carried more than necessity. It also carried objects of pure desire. Up north along the Baltic coast, another treasure formed. Amber to ancient eyes, this wasn't tree resin. It was sunlight made solid. A piece of the sun itself, captured and cooled. It glowed with a warm, internal fire. It felt magical to the touch, light as a feather, but when you rubbed it against cloth, it could attract dust and straw. A clear sign of hidden power. In myth, it was the tears of goddesses or the solidified rays of a sun god. It was believed to hold the essence of life, to offer healing and protection. And for the civilizations around the Mediterranean, this gold of the north became an obsession. Its journey south was perilous along what we call the Amber Road. Think of it not as a single path, but a shifting web, trails and riverways and portages connecting two different worlds. On one end, the forest tribes who gathered it from the sea. On the other, the courts of Mycenaean kings and Egyptian pharaohs. They saw in this glowing stone a divine substance. A single amber necklace from a tomb in Mycenae tells an epic. That bead traveled over 1,000 miles. It passed through countless hands. Each transfer was a moment of tension, a negotiation, a potential for conflict. The tribes who controlled the source, people like the ancient Prussians, held incredible leverage. They weren't just collectors. They were gatekeepers to a celestial commodity. This created a constant, simmering pressure. Tribes clashed for control of the richest shorelines. They dealt with intermediaries from the south, relationships that could easily tip from trade into raiding. The amber itself was lightweight and incredibly valuable. Its caravans were prime targets for bandits. This wasn't large-scale warfare between empires. It was a centuries-long, low-intensity struggle, a struggle over access, over tariffs paid in blood, over the right to profit from the sun's frozen tears. Later Norse sagas echo this, even in a different age. They tell of cursed gold, of rings that bring strife, of wealth that severs kinship. These stories feel like a cultural memory of what amber trade could do. A beautiful object born from light could cast a long shadow of conflict. It shows a crucial truth. Warfare wasn't only driven by what you needed to survive, like tin for bronze. It was also fueled by what you desperately wanted, for status, for ritual, for a connection to the divine. That deep, irrational desire for a luxury could reshape landscapes. It could reshape destinies just as powerfully as any military necessity, and it leads to a final, fragrant resource, one that literally perfumed the path to the divine. and drew empires into a silent, desperate war. The sun's light could be caught in amber, but the breath of the gods that was held in something else, down in the deserts of southern Arabia. Wealth didn't come from the ground, it came from trees, from their bark, frankincense and myrrh. These resins hardened, they were worth more than gold. Because they weren't just luxury, they were a necessity, the way you spoke to the divine everywhere: Rome, India, Egypt, medicine, funerals, temples. Civilization ran on that smoke that created an empire of scent, run by kingdoms like the Sabaeans, the Nabateans. Their power wasn't from fertile land. It was from brutal geography. They controlled the trees, and they controlled the way out, the paths, the incense route. 1,000 miles of life and danger. Caravans of camels, each one a fortune in resin, moving slow, dictated by thirst, by fear. It wasn't a road, it was a bottleneck, and everyone knew it. That wealth built Petra, a city carved into red stone, a monument to trade protected by cliffs, but that wealth was a beacon desert tribes would raid. Not for conquest, for a single caravan. One caravan could sustain them for years. Neighboring kingdoms watched with jealousy. That tension is in a famous story. The Queen of Sheba, going to King Solomon, told as wisdom, splendor, but it was likely a summit, economic superpowers. She brought camels, spices, gold, precious stones. But the gift mentioned with reverence, a vast quantity of frankincense and myrrh. That wasn't just a gift, it was a display, source control, a king showing another the very substance that fueled his connection to heaven. Centuries later, the pattern repeated, bigger, more violent. The Roman Empire, frustrated by the cost, they didn't just want to buy incense, they wanted to own the trees. Their military campaigns into Arabia, Felix, fertile Arabia, motivated by a brutal logic, cut out the middlemen, seized the source. They failed, defeated less by armies, more by the desert itself. But the attempt shows everything. When a society believes a substance is essential for its spiritual survival, the line between worship and warfare vanishes. The battle for incense, a quiet, desperate war under a burning sun. The prize wasn't territory, it was the approval of the gods, and that brings us to the ultimate symbol of that desire. A substance so iconic, its very name is a synonym for impossible wealth. Gold was just different. It had no use. You couldn't eat it. You couldn't make a tool from it. It couldn't heal you, but it became the ultimate thing to have. Its power was all in the mind, a power so deep it felt written into the universe itself. For the Egyptians, gold was the flesh of the gods. The sun god Ra had skin of gold. To own gold was to hold a piece of divinity, a piece of immortality. That belief didn't just inspire art, it launched armies. Look south to Kush in what's now Sudan. The deserts there held legendary gold mines. For the pharaohs, this wasn't just a rich region. It was a divine command. Temple carvings show it, not just mining, conquest. The pharaoh towering, striking his enemies. The message was direct. Securing the gold was a holy war. A necessary violence to please the gods and secure the kingdom's eternal glory. The drive was absolute. It turned a soft, yellow metal into an engine of empire. And this pattern repeated centuries later. When Spanish conquistadors heard tales of El Dorado, a city of gold, they weren't just hearing a story, they were hearing the same ancient call. The New World myth was a new chapter in a very old story. The search for a place where gold was so common it was trivial. That dream justified any hardship, any conflict. A pursuit that reshaped continents. Mythology warned about this hunger. The story of King Midas, his wish came true. Everything he touched turned to gold. First a dream, then a horror. He couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't embrace his own daughter. The myth isn't about wealth, it's about the isolation it creates. How the desire for this divine metal can cut you off from everything human, everything real. But on a global scale, there was no warning like that. the practical uses of gold once found only sped up the chase. In Lydia, around the 7th century B.C., huge gold reserves were stamped into the world's first coins. That was a revolution. It turned wealth from something kept in temples into something that could raise an army. Pay a soldier, fund a campaign anywhere. Economy and warfare fused together. When the Persian Empire rose, its conquests were fueled by the gold treasures it took from every kingdom it crushed. The cycle fed itself: conquer to get gold, use gold to fund more conquest. The symbolic value had completely overtaken any practical use. It motivated movements of people. The rise and fall of dynasties, profound cultural loss. The pursuit was so absolute, it makes you wonder, what happens when the obsession isn't with a symbol of the gods, but with something brutally practical? Something every single person in every single home needs every single day. The next resource shifted the focus from the temples of the elite to the hearths of common people. And the wars it sparked were fought not for glory but for simple survival. Gold could build temples and fund armies, but you couldn't eat it. You needed something else. A white crystal, salt. It was the only way to preserve food for winter, to cure meat for a journey, to feed an army. Without it, survival was at risk. This mineral became a kind of edible money. The word salary comes from the Latin for salt money, what a Roman soldier was paid. Its value wasn't symbolic. It was biological, so controlling a salt spring, a coastal salt pan, was like holding the keys to life itself. Ancient roads were paved for salt. The Via Salaria, the salt road, went straight into Rome. It wasn't a luxury route, it was a lifeline. Control that road, and you controlled the city's stomach. In China, along the Yellow River, some of the earliest states and conflicts might have been about controlling salt production. Legendary battles happened over salt wells. To produce and distribute this mineral wasn't just commerce. It was the foundation of political power. A ruler who could guarantee salt could guarantee stability. And that power was worth fighting for. Then, in Africa, the equation flipped. In the empires of Ghana and Mali, gold was plentiful in the south, but salt was scarce. So a trade emerged. Caravans of camels, hundreds of them, would cross the Sahara from the north, carrying slabs of salt mined from places like Tagheza. In the south, they'd trade that salt for its weight in gold. This trade didn't just connect economies, it built empires on a balance of absolute need. The control of Tagheza, this miserable, sun-scorched mining settlement, was a constant source of tension. It was a prize with no water, no comfort, only back-breaking labor and a substance more precious than comfort. To cut off a city's salt was a weapon of war as effective as any siege. It meant slow starvation, economic collapse, surrender. This white gold shows a shift. The most devastating conflicts weren't always over what glittered. They were over what was plain, essential, non-negotiable. The struggle for a fundamental necessity could forge empires and shatter cities with a quiet, relentless violence. It grounded the quest for luxury in a much starker reality. And that reality would soon demand a different kind of resource, not for preserving life, but for taking it on a new scale. The age of salt gave way to another age, a hungrier, harder age, the age of iron. Iron changed things. It was harder, more common, and it required a different kind of fighting. But the real fight wasn't just over the metal. It was over the geography that brought it. To understand the ancient world, you have to forget the maps of empires. You look at the lines instead, the thin lines, rivers, mountain passes, narrow seas. These were the arteries, and where they got narrow, that's where conflict happened. It's like a bottleneck in a crowded hallway. Everyone has to go through that one tight spot. Control that spot, and you control the movement. The ancient world was full of these natural bottlenecks. The Strait of Gibraltar was the big gate between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. hold its shores, and you controlled access to the tin from Britain. The Dardanelles, that narrow waterway by Troy, was the key to the Black Sea, to the grain and metals and amber from the north. The Sinai Peninsula was a brutal land bridge. The only way for Egyptian armies to reach the copper mines of the Levant, the only way for incense caravans to reach Egypt. These places weren't just scenery. They were perpetual battlegrounds. Forts were built there, taxes were collected there, wars were fought there for centuries because the prize wasn't the rock you stood on. It was the right to charge a toll on every dream, every need, every ounce of wealth that flowed through. This logic went all the way to the source. Societies didn't just find a gold mine and start digging. They fortified it, they made it a fortress. The huge walls of Mycenaean citadels, like Mycenae itself, they weren't just protecting a king, they were guarding the valleys. The local sources of wealth that fed the kingdom. Petra is the ultimate example, carved into red cliffs. Its genius wasn't beauty, it was defensibility. It controlled a crucial fork in the incense route. Caravans had no choice but to go through its narrow canyon. The Nabateans didn't need a big army. The geography was their army. This is why mythology puts monsters at resource-rich places. A dragon guarding a golden fleece, a god protecting a sacred grove. These aren't just stories, they're explanations for a harsh reality. That a valuable place is dangerous and contested for a reason. The monster is the resistance of the people who guard it, or the peril of the journey itself. No one mastered this geographic chessboard better than the Phoenicians. From cities like Tyre and Sidon, they became the supreme navigators, but their colonies from Carthage to Cadiz weren't about building a land empire. They were about building a network, a chain of secured ports, each one a stepping stone, a safe harbor, a marketplace. This network gave them control over Spanish silver, British tin, African gold, and of course this created constant friction. Local populations saw their lands become way stations. Rivals like the Greeks set up their own colonies in competition. The clashes that followed from Sicily to Corsica were naval wars for economic destiny, fights over who would control the map of supply. When you see ancient conflict through this lens, the famous battles look different. They weren't random grabs for glory. They were calculated moves in a long campaign to dominate the board, to own the bottlenecks, the sources, the sea lanes in between. And that final element, the sea, would become the most volatile battlefield, where control was never guaranteed, and the stakes were the fate of continents. The sea was the last frontier, and it was the most unstable. On land, you could build a wall. At sea, there were no walls, only the horizon and opportunity. This open space became the decisive place for the ancient resource war. To control the sea was to control the flow of everything, so the first navies were born. Not for exploration, for protection. The earliest naval battle we know of was the Egyptians fighting the Sea Peoples, around 1175 BC. It was a defense of the Nile Delta. The invaders came by ship, threatening the heart of Egypt. Pharaoh Ramesses III pushed them back. His temple carvings show the chaos, Egyptian archers on decks. Enemy ships capsizing. This wasn't a clash of empires over land. It was a fight for survival against a force that moved on water. They likely disrupted the trade networks Egypt needed. The sea had become a highway for commerce and for catastrophe. That dynamic turned every merchant ship into a potential target, and the men who attacked them weren't always outlaws. Not in the modern sense, they were privateers, state-sponsored pirates. A king could fund a fleet of fast ships to prey on a rival's tin shipments or incense caravans, cripple their economy without ever declaring war. The line between a naval hero and a pirate was thin. In the Odyssey, Odysseus talks about raiding coastal towns. Is he a returning king or a celebrated raider? The myth shows a blurred reality. Piracy was an alternative economy, a tool of statecraft, a constant threat that made every voyage a gamble. This insecurity demanded a specific kind of ship, and that ship demanded specific resources. You couldn't build a war galley from just any tree. You needed long, straight timber. Resilient, the cedar forests of Lebanon were legendary. The wood was strong, fragrant, resistant to rot. To secure that floating forest was to secure naval power. Egyptian pharaohs sent expeditions to Lebanon for cedar. The story of Gilgamesh traveling to a distant cedar forest to defeat its guardian, that takes on a new meaning. It's a myth about the peril of securing strategic materials. Control the forests and you control the shipyards. Control the shipyards and you control the sea. The ultimate mythic expression of this is the voyage of the Argo. Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece is a heroic adventure, but look at its structure. It's a state-funded naval expedition, commissioned by a king who wants a usurper gone. The Argo is a cutting-edge vessel, built with divine help and the best timber. Its crew is a roster of Greece's greatest heroes, a specialized military unit. Their mission is to go to the edge of the known world, to Colchis on the Black Sea, and retrieve a critical asset. They face natural obstacles, clashing rocks, hostile forces along the way. This isn't just a fairy tale. It's a poetic blueprint for an ancient resource mission, where diplomacy and force and sailing skill were all needed to bring the prize home. These pressures created a struggle over narrow sea corridors. The Greco-Persian Wars were, at their core, a fight for the Aegean Sea. For Persia, controlling the Aegean meant securing its empire's western flank and the trade routes that fed it. For the Greek city-states, losing the Aegean meant economic suffocation. The Athenian victory at Salamis wasn't just about freedom. It was about preserving their maritime lifeline, their access to grain from the Black Sea. Metals from the West, the trireme, the fast warship of the era, was the ultimate expression of this naval arms race. Building it and crewing it required immense wealth. A population dedicated to the sea, so piracy, naval battles, legendary voyages, they all come from the same source, the desperate need to keep resource lines open, or to sever an enemy's lines. This established a pattern of power. It would echo for thousands of years, from the Roman fleet clearing the Mediterranean of pirates to secure its grain, to the colonial empires later on. The principle held: he who controlled the sea lanes controlled the wealth of the world, and often that control began with a single cargo, moving across a sun-dazzled, dangerous sea, with fortunes and kingdoms resting on its safe passage. The sea lanes were a visible battlefield, but the real war was silent, fought with papyrus and promises. In the ancient world, a merchant was a king's best weapon. He went where armies couldn't. He saw what spies could only imagine. And he carried more than goods. He carried information, influence, the quiet threat of economic ruin. This was diplomacy as covert war. A trade agreement could be a trap. A gift could be a statement. We see it in the Amarna letters, these clay tablets from Egypt. They're the diplomatic letters between pharaohs and other kings. The Hittites, smaller city-states. The language is full of brotherly love, but the tension underneath is pure. They're always negotiating exchanges, not just gold and silver. Iron, glass, horses. A king might write, "My brother, why have you sent such poor iron?" Or, "The gold was less than you promised." These aren't complaints between friends. They're calibrated insults, a veiled accusation of cheating. The response could be a threat, a withdrawal of favor, or troops mustering. A shipment of bad goods wasn't just poor business. It was a breach of protocol so deep it could justify a military campaign. The whole system ran on a balance, gift and obligation. To accept a lavish gift from a more powerful ruler was to accept a debt. It created a political bond that was hard to break. Economics and statecraft were the same language. The masters of this were the Phoenicians. From Tyre and Sidon, their merchants spread across the Mediterranean. But they were never just merchants. They were cultural translators. They learned local languages, adopted local customs that gave them unparalleled access. They could report on a rival's military strength. They could sense instability in a kingdom that supplied silver. Their trade networks were the first great intelligence networks. A Phoenician merchant in a Greek port wasn't just selling purple dye. He was gathering data, information that kept his homeland secure and wealthy. He was a non-violent combatant in a perpetual economic war. This practice of weaponized gifts appears everywhere. In ancient Mesoamerica, elites exchanged mirrors made of obsidian. This volcanic glass was sharp, valuable, hard to work. To give such a mirror was a statement. It said, "I have access to distant, dangerous resources. I have craftsmen of great skill. By accepting it, you acknowledge my power." You enter a relationship. It was political manipulation through objects, a way to build alliances, to create a web of obligation for later. Inevitably, this high-stakes system broke down. When one side felt chronically shortchanged, when gifts weren't reciprocated, the accusations started. The result was often an embargo, a cutting off of trade. In the ancient world, an embargo was an act of war, a siege at a distance. To deny a kingdom tin or timber or incense was to strangle its economy and cripple its military. The offended party then had a clear casus belli, a reason for war everyone understood. We see this pattern in myth, the conflict between Greeks and Trojans. It starts with a broken guest friendship, a violation of the sacred rules of exchange and hospitality. The abduction of Helen is the ultimate diplomatic insult. The theft of the most precious gift, the epic war that follows, is, in this light, the catastrophic failure of a political and economic system. This blurring of lines makes one thing clear. In antiquity, there was no real separation between a merchant caravan and a military supply column. The same donkeys that carried copper ingots in peace could carry them to an allied army in war. The same ships that transported grain could be commandeered for troops. The economy was the logistics arm of the state. Every trade route was a potential invasion route. Every warehouse was a strategic stockpile. The coin of the realm, whether stamped metal or a bar of salt, was literally a tool for funding the next conquest. And this endless cycle of acquisition and conflict would eventually demand a different kind of resource, not a metal or a spice, a living, breathing asset. One that powered the entire engine from the deepest mine to the farthest battlefield. That living, breathing asset was human energy, but to command that energy, a civilization needed to inspire awe. It needed a color, the color of heaven, a deep, celestial blue flecked with gold, Lapis Lazuli. For the ancient world, this stone wasn't just beautiful. It was a piece of the firmament brought down to earth, a connection to the divine, and it came from only one place, the remote mountains of Badakhshan, in what's now Afghanistan. To have lapis was to hold a fragment of the night sky. Its value was incalculable because its journey was nearly impossible. Extracting it was a feat. Miners followed narrow veins of blue deep into the mountains in dangerous, cramped conditions. Then the raw stone had to travel over 1,500 miles of forbidding terrain. Across the Iranian plateau, through lands of rival tribes and empires, every step was a gamble. Caravans faced blistering heat, scarce water, the constant threat of bandits who knew the value of that cargo. This immense difficulty made lapis precious. Its price wasn't just about beauty, it was a tax on distance, danger, and desire. That desire was absolute for the pharaohs. They called it kespt, the stone of the gods. It was crushed into ultramarine pigment for the tombs of kings. It was inlaid into Tutankhamun's golden mask, surrounding his eyes with eternal sky. This demand created an economic engine thousands of miles away. The mines of Badakhshan likely financed local chieftains, fueled conflicts, created a warlord economy based on controlling this single export. Wealth from the Nile Valley flowed into the Hindu Kush, shaping politics in a land the Egyptians would never see. This connection echoes in myth. In Mesopotamian stories, the gods sometimes lived in a far-off eastern mountain land, a place of dazzling jewels and blue stone. Scholars see in that a possible mythological memory, a recollection of that distant, almost mythical source of wealth, the land where the sky was pulled from the ground. The trade routes became the true legacy. These paths worn by merchants and pack animals were veins of more than commerce. They carried ideas, languages, technologies between Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and beyond. But this exchange had a dark twin. The same routes were irresistible targets. Every kingdom and tribe along the way sought to tax the caravans, to demand tribute for safe passage. Controlling a key mountain pass or oasis meant controlling a stream of wealth without ever touching a mine. It set empires and nomads against each other in a silent struggle over the right to profit from heaven's stone. The story of Lapis Lazuli is a pattern. A single, non-essential, yet spiritually profound resource linked the fate of desert kingdoms with mountain miners. It created a chain of conflict and cooperation across continents, driven by the human need for a symbol. That same pattern, born from a blue stone in Afghanistan, would be written again an ocean away. When a new world was found and a new color would drive empires to madness, across the ocean the same story played out, but in green stone and blue sky. In the jungles of Mesoamerica, jade wasn't just decoration, it was the essence of life. The Maya saw its green as the color of young maize, of water. The life force itself. To wear jade was to wear a piece of the living earth. It became the mark of kingship. They'd place it in a ruler's mouth at death, a seed for rebirth. And like Lapis, it came from one place, the Motagua River Valley in Guatemala. That accident of geology made the whole Maya world interdependent. Rival city-states all needed the same thing from that narrow source. It created a permanent tension. Inscriptions describe wars where the goal was to capture a quarry. A king wouldn't just defeat a rival, he'd seize its access to the green stone. The conquest was economic, aimed at the source. To control jade was to control the symbol of divine right. Without it, a king's legitimacy could break. His connection to the gods broken, so the wars for jade were wars for cosmological authority, fought with earthly weapons. Then far to the north, in the American Southwest, another color held power. Turquoise, the color of water in a dry land. For the ancestral Pueblones, this stone was a piece of the sky, a blessing, mined with immense effort from places like the Cerrillos Hills. Using stone tools to follow thin veins deep into the earth, and then it traveled. Turquoise beads and pendants are found in great numbers at places like Choco Canyon. Centers of ceremony and trade, but the journey didn't stop. This blue-green stone went over 1,000 miles south, into Mexico, found in offerings at Teotihuacan. That tells us of a trade network of staggering scale, connecting desert miners to distant metropolitan elites. Where that kind of value flows, conflict follows. Evidence of outright warfare over the mines might be subtle, but the pressure to control such a resource would have been immense. Access to the best mines likely defined alliances. Sparked raids shaped the political landscape for centuries, a quiet struggle over a piece of the sky. This cycle reached its peak with the Aztec Empire. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was a marvel on a lake, but its splendor was built on a simple, brutal engine. Tribute, conquered cities didn't just surrender. They were entered into a ledger. Their penalty was a monthly delivery of specific goods. The lists were meticulous. Baskets of maize, bags of cacao, bundles of cotton. And then the items of elite power: gold dust, quetzal feathers, polished jade. The empire's military expansion was in many ways a shopping list written in blood. They fought to acquire new tributaries, to send the exotic materials that fueled the noble class and state rituals. The demand was insatiable. To maintain the system, they had to keep conquering. A new province meant new resources, but also new borders to defend, new resentments to manage. It was a pyramid scheme of imperial power. The only way to sustain the top was to constantly widen the base through warfare. Their god of war demanded sustenance. That meant constant conquest for captives. But the practical engine driving it all was the need for a continuous flow of luxury goods. Into the heart of the empire, these New World parallels are a revelation. They show the dynamic we saw from the Bronze Age to the incense route wasn't a peculiar invention of the Mediterranean. It was a human constant, from the jungles of Guatemala to the deserts of New Mexico. Civilizations separated by oceans arrived at the same brutal equation. Rare resources equal power, control over them equals security, and the desire for them, especially when wrapped in divine meaning, equals conflict. The materials changed. Jade for the Maya, turquoise for the Pueblones, feathers for the Aztecs, but the underlying pattern was identical. It proves the drive to possess the rare and the sacred, and to fight for its source, is woven into the fabric of complex society itself. Which raises a final question. If this pattern is so universal, so deeply rooted in our past, what happened when these ancient systems of resource hunger met on a global scale? When the old world finally sailed into the new, that collision would rewrite the map of desire forever. That collision was always destiny, a divine mission. The stories a civilization tells itself about its own purpose, they're rarely just entertainment, they're often a weapon, a way to turn the brutal work of taking what you need into something noble. Something holy. Mythology became the ultimate propaganda tool for resource wars. It dressed economic necessity in the robes of cosmic duty. Take the Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish. It tells of the god Marduk rising to battle the primordial sea goddess Tiamat, a force of chaos. He defeats her, and from her body he creates the ordered world. But this wasn't just a creation story. It was recited annually in Babylon. The message was clear. Marduk's victory established his supreme kingship over all gods. And by extension, it established Babylon's king as Marduk's representative on earth. His right to rule, his right to control the land, the life-giving rivers. The epic was a sacred blueprint. Just as Marduk brought order from watery chaos, the Babylonian state brought agricultural order. It controlled irrigation. It claimed fertile land. The myth justified their control over the most vital resource, water, by framing it as a continuation of the god's own work. Conquest wasn't theft, it was the spread of divine order. In Greece, the myth took a different form, but equally potent, the Amazonomachy, the great battle between Greek heroes and the Amazons. Those warrior women from the edges of the map. This scene was carved on the shield of Athena's statue in the Parthenon, on countless temple friezes. Why was this story everywhere? The Amazons represented the ultimate other, a society that inverted Greek norms. They were foreign, powerful, and they occupied lands rich in mythic association. Like the Black Sea coast, by depicting their defeat, Greek art was broadcasting an ideology. It showed civilization, Greek civilization, triumphing over barbarism. It was a metaphor for the Greek colonial expansion happening in real time, founding cities on foreign shores, accessing new sources of grain, metals, timber. The myth made that expansion feel righteous, a heroic struggle to bring Greek order to chaotic, wealthy frontiers. It turned economic exploitation into a cultural crusade. No one refined this machinery like the Romans. Virgil's Aeneid, commissioned by Emperor Augustus. It's the masterpiece of the form, the story of Aeneas. A Trojan prince fleeing the burning city. After many trials, he arrives in Italy. His destiny, declared by the gods, is to found a people who will rule the world. The poem is a foundation myth for the Roman Empire. It says their relentless conquest wasn't aggression, it was fate, a divine mandate to bring peace and law to all nations. This story provided the perfect cover for what followed: the systematic extraction of resources from conquered provinces, the silver mines of Spain that bankrolled Rome, the grain from Egypt that fed its populace, the marble from quarries across the Mediterranean that built its monuments. These weren't acts of plunder. They were, according to the myth, the natural fruits of Roman rule. The province's role in the destined order, resistance to Roman tax collectors, wasn't just political. It was a rebellion against fate itself. This pattern is the key. By framing resource acquisition as a sacred duty, a heroic quest, a battle against chaos, ruling elites did something profound. They mobilized entire populations for distant wars. A farmer conscripted into the army could believe he was fighting for glory and the gods, not for his emperor's new silver supply. The economic motive was masked in spiritual grandeur. It made the costs of war feel meaningful. This asks us to read ancient stories with a critical eye. Are they mere tales of adventure and divinity, or are they the propaganda leaflets of their time, carefully crafted narratives designed to rally public support for economically motivated campaigns, to justify the seizure of land, mines, and trade routes as part of a grand divine plan? That blurring of spiritual and material motive had another victim. A quieter one that bore the scars long after the temples crumbled. The very land and water that provided the wealth in the first place. Those stories about divine missions and heroic quests, they don't usually talk about the cost. The treasures from the ancient world, the ones that glittered, they came from places of real hardship. To feed the furnaces that smelted bronze, forests had to fall. Huge areas of woodland were cleared just to make charcoal. That was the only fuel hot enough to pull metal from rock. And this wasn't a small change. In places like Cyprus, famous for its copper, or parts of the Near East, the demand for timber and charcoal changed the landscape for generations. The soil, once held by roots, it washed away. Some researchers think this local deforestation might have even shifted microclimates, made the land less able to support the very civilizations that stripped it. So the pursuit of one resource consumed another in a cycle that scarred the earth. And then there was the human cost that was measured in lifetimes of labor. Take the silver mines of Laurion near Athens. Those silver veins were the economic engine of Athenian democracy. They paid for the triremes that won at Salamis. They funded the Parthenon, but that wealth came from the darkness. The mines were a network of cramped, stifling tunnels, worked by a large population of enslaved people. Conditions were severe, constant danger from collapse from bad air. So the brilliance of Athenian culture, its philosophy and art, it was shadowed by that. Its military power, its political experiment, they were built in part on that foundation. That pattern was a cruel constant. Far to the south, the gold mines of Nubia fueled the ambitions of Egyptian pharaohs. Inscriptions celebrate the gold, but the archaeological record tells a quieter story. Mining settlements were isolated, fortified outposts. The work of extracting ore from quartz under the desert sun was grueling. A hardship borne by prisoners of war, by conscripted laborers. Centuries later, the Romans replicated this system, but on an industrial scale. At Los Medulas in Spain, they used a devastating technique called hushing. They'd direct torrents of water to blast away entire mountainsides, searching for gold. The landscape was transformed forever, and the labor that powered it was immense. For those condemned to that work, it was often a permanent sentence. This relentless draw on the environment and on human communities created a deep fragility. Some historians looking at the end of the Late Bronze Age see a cascade of failure. those complex networks that moved tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus. They were like a delicate web. When climate shifts or political unrest severed a few critical strands, the whole system shuddered. Kingdoms that depended on imported bronze for their weapons and tools found their supply cut. Economies faltered. That vulnerability likely made the great palaces easy targets for the movements we call the Sea Peoples. The collapse wasn't a single event. It was a chain reaction, a world exhausted by its own consumption, buckling under a pressure it couldn't manage anymore. These lasting scars challenge any simple, romantic view of antiquity. They force you to see the full picture. The gleaming statue, the gold coin, the bronze sword, each one was an endpoint, the final product of a long chain. A chain that began in a stripped forest, or a dark tunnel, or a shattered mountainside. That legacy connects the tools of war directly to the land and the people they ultimately consumed. And it reveals a truth that echoes far beyond the ancient world. The shape of warfare came from what was in the ground. What a society could get its hands on decided how it fought. What it fought with, who could even be part of the fight. The move from bronze to iron shows it best. That wasn't just an upgrade, it was a revolution. Bronze needed tin, and tin was rare, found in far-off places, but iron ore was common. It was everywhere. Once people like the Hittites figured out how to smelt it at high heat, everything shifted. Iron was harder, cheaper to make in large amounts. It broke the monopoly the Bronze Age elites had. The Hittites knew what they had. They guarded the iron, working secrets like a state treasure. For a while, that made them unbeatable. Later, groups like the Philistines, the ones you read about as fierce enemies, they probably rose up because they mastered this technology, too. It was a democratizing metal. They could challenge the old kingdoms not with more money, but with better, more accessible metal. Controlling a resource just rewrote the rules of power. But metal didn't win battles by itself. Speed won battles, and that speed came from the grasslands, the Eurasian steppes. Controlling horse breeding lands gave an advantage so deep it scared the settled empires. Nomads like the Scythians grew up with horses. Rider and horse became one thing, a single, fluid entity that gave them a devastating mobility. They could raid, retreat, harass, and there was nothing you could do. For the farming empires from China to Persia, the steppe was a constant threat. Their answer was usually to try and secure the resource itself. Launch wars to control the breeding grounds, or to counter it with huge projects like building walls to slow down the cavalry they could never match. The horse, this living resource, dictated a whole style of war for hundreds of years. This idea found its most systematic form with the Assyrian Empire. Their reputation for brutal, relentless campaigns that wasn't just conquest for its own sake. It was a machine, and the machine had a hungry engine. That engine needed constant fuel. Horses for its chariots and cavalry, iron and copper for its weapons, and huge amounts of timber for siege engines, for the infrastructure of an empire. Every new campaign secured the resources to launch the next one. It was a perfect feedback loop, terrifying. Warfare to get the means to wage more warfare. Even at sea, victory was made from specific trees. The Athenian trireme, that fast, sleek warship that saved Greece at Salamis, it was a masterpiece. But it depended on a very earthly list. It needed long, straight, resilient timber for the hull, for the massive oars. Not just any wood would work. It needed pitch, that sticky tar, to seal the planks. That made forested regions with the right trees, places like Macedonia or Thrace, strategic targets long before anyone wanted them for territory. A naval power wasn't just a nation with a coast. It was a nation with a guaranteed supply line to a forest. So the evolution of tactics, from chariots to naval battles, it was never just a story of human cleverness. It was a story of material constraint and opportunity. The available resources shaped the weapons. The The need for those weapons shaped the borders, and the fight to secure those borders started the next war. It was an ancient arms race where the finish line was always another mine, another forest, another grassy plain just over the horizon, the Trojan War. We think of it as this great mythological clash, honor, wrath, the face that launched 1,000 ships, but there's another layer underneath all that. A very practical one. It might have been about resources, about a trade route. The story we know is Helen, a queen stolen, a war fought for her return. But what if she was just the pretext? The real cause was geography, Troy's location. Historians point to this. The city was built on a hill, overlooking a narrow strait. The Dardanelles, this was the only passage, the single gateway for ships to move from the Aegean Sea into the Black Sea. That passage was everything. It was a lifeline. Grain from the north came through it to feed populations in the south. Metals came through, tin from places like the Caucasus, tin you needed to make bronze. Which was the foundation of their civilization, really? Mycenaean civilization, and Troy controlled it. They controlled the flow, they could charge tolls. They could stop ships. They had a monopoly on the most important trade route of that age. So when the Greek kings gathered their forces, it wasn't just about an insult. It was strategic. They were trying to break a chokehold on their economic survival. You see it in the Iliad itself. The epic is full of plunder. Warriors fighting for bronze tripods, for cauldrons, for gold, for captive women. These are spoils, listed like an inventory. The objective was wealth. Helen's restoration was the noble cause, but the real prize was the strait, control of that water, and all the wealth it brought. Archaeology shows this pattern. The site of Troy has layers, destruction, then rebuilding over centuries. This wasn't a city struck by bad luck once. It was a fortress attacked again and again. Probably for the same reason, every time its position, that was its fortune and its curse. The Mycenaean Greeks, with all their heroes, were likely just one in a long line. One more power that saw that bottleneck and wanted it. So the Trojan War starts to look less like a singular myth, more like a pattern, a legendary tale dressing up an ancient struggle. A struggle for control, over trade routes, over supply lines, over the scarce resources that let a kingdom flourish or caused it to collapse. The gods on Olympus chose sides. But the battle was fought over a strip of water and the right to tax every ship that passed. This reading doesn't make the epic smaller, it grounds it. In a human reality we can understand. It shows how our grandest stories often serve as camouflage, brilliant camouflage, hiding the economic engines. The silent wars for access and advantage, hiding them beneath a surface of personal drama and celestial will. If a story as foundational as Troy's fall can be read this way, it makes you look at other legendary conflicts differently. To listen for the quiet hum of commerce beneath the roar of battle. Troy's fate was a pattern, and centuries later, that pattern reached its most chilling conclusion. In recorded history, the Roman annihilation of Carthage. For over a century, Rome and Carthage fought the Punic Wars. They're remembered as a clash of titans. A struggle for the soul of the Mediterranean. But beneath the epic battles, the march of Hannibal's elephants, the engine was brutally simple. It was a fight over who would control the wealth of the Western Sea. Carthage held the keys. They dominated the trade in Spanish silver. That metal funded armies. They controlled the fertile North African grain fields. The fields that could feed cities, and perhaps most crucially, they guarded the gateway to the Atlantic, the tin routes from Britain, the tin the Romans desperately needed. Carthage wasn't just a rival empire, it was a choke point on Rome's economic future, and this fear found its voice in a single, relentless senator, Cato the Elder. He ended every speech on any topic with the same grim phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. It wasn't a call for military victory. It was a demand for erasure, for the removal of a commercial competitor so complete it could never rise again. After the final siege, the Romans didn't just burn the city. They enacted a final, symbolic punishment. They're said to have sown the fertile fields around Carthage with salt. This was more than symbolism. It was a calculated act of resource denial. Salt sterilizes the earth. It prevents crops from growing. By salting the land, Rome was ensuring the agricultural base that had fed Carthage's wealth. Its people, its very existence would lie barren. It was economic warfare made literal. The goal was to sever the city's connection to the life-giving land forever, to make sure no community could ever take root there again. The destruction was so thorough it feels like a lesson carved in stone. When ancient conflicts were driven by control of essential resources, the stakes weren't just victory or defeat. They were existence or oblivion. The obliteration of Carthage set a dark precedent. It showed that in the calculus of ancient power, a rival's economic potential was a threat. A threat that could justify its total removal from the map. This logic of absolute security would echo through the ages, but it would also create its own vulnerabilities. For an empire that had eliminated its greatest rival, the next threats wouldn't come from a single city. They would come from the very edges of its own overstretched, resource-hungry domain. Resources and power have always been tied together, and power has always had a gender. In the ancient world, the female form became a symbol for the resources empires wanted to control. A beautiful woman could be a prize like a silver mine. A goddess could embody the sea's unpredictable bounty. This tells us something. The ancient scramble for wealth was seen through a gendered lens. Take Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. In Homer, she's the ultimate object of desire, a possession whose theft starts a war, but symbolically, she's more than that. She is the contested resource. Her beauty is a rare treasure. The conflict over her mirrors real wars over ports and trade routes. She's not just a cause. She's a metaphor for the kind of exclusive asset kingdoms would mobilize entire fleets to possess. This symbolism extends to the gods. Aphrodite, goddess of love, was born from sea foam. That's poetic, but it ties her to the maritime world, the same chaotic realm that provided fish and trade and hid pirates. She embodies the allure and danger of seeking wealth from the water. Desiring her favor was like desiring safe passage. It was the pursuit of a resource essential for survival. In history, this symbolism became a tool. Royal marriages were contracts sealed with a person. An Egyptian pharaoh marrying a Hittite princess wasn't just a union. It was a fusion of two economic spheres. It meant peace on a contested frontier, open trade routes, secure access to Anatolian silver and timber. The woman was the living token of that alliance. Her body cemented the deal. Then there's the Queen of Sheba visiting King Solomon. The story has attraction and awe, but its core is an exchange of intelligence and wealth. She tests his wisdom with riddles. He impresses her with splendor. Her gifts are camels laden with spices, gold, precious incense. This is a summit between economic powers. The queen is a sovereign negotiator, using her nation's control of the frankincense trade to engage on equal footing. It shows how women in power could shape the resource diplomacy of their age. Yet if women could symbolize the coveted resource, they could also symbolize the danger of reaching for it. Mythology put fearsome female guardians at the world's edges. The Gorgons with serpent hair and a petrifying gaze were placed in remote, rocky landscapes. To seek them out was to risk everything. The golden apples of the Hesperides were guarded by a dragon, but the orchard was tended by nymphs. Female figures in an inaccessible, paradisiacal land. These narratives taught a lesson. The most valuable prizes were protected by profound peril, often given a feminine form. The message was clear: the path to ultimate wealth is fraught with monstrous risk, so the imagery served two purposes. women represented the glittering objective of desire. And the lethal cost of overreaching for it. A beautiful queen could launch a fleet. A guardian monster could turn an army to stone. This gendered discourse shaped how people thought about the pursuit of wealth. It was an alluring, romanticized endeavor, but one shadowed by the threat of catastrophic loss. It framed the economic engines of empire within human dramas of desire, possession, and danger. And as these empires grew, their consumption strained against the world's boundaries, prompting a search not just for new resources, but for a new understanding of the cosmos that contained them. Conflict wasn't just one side acting. Every clash, every tense negotiation along a trade route, it made a kind of strange, fertile ground. People met, and they didn't just trade goods. They traded glances, gestures, words. They saw each other's tools, their gods, their art. In the shadow of war over resources, culture quietly bloomed in the spaces between. The roads built for conquest became avenues for everything else. The Amber Road, that ancient highway for the sun's frozen tears, carried more than glowing stone. It carried stories, it carried styles. Those intricate spiral patterns common in northern European art started showing up on Mediterranean pottery. The myth of the sun god's journey, told in the south, might have traveled north with a merchant. Found new form under the Baltic sky. This wasn't a formal exchange. It was accidental pollination, a design seen on a trader's cloak copied by a local craftsperson. A new technique for working metal, observed and then adapted. The conflict over access created the contact, and contact, however grudging, sparked creation. You see it in the deserts along the incense route. Kingdoms fought bitterly to control the flow of sacred smoke. But in the caravanserais, the overnight stops, a different fusion happened. The Nabateans, masters of Petra, absorbed architectural ideas from their Assyrian and Egyptian trading partners, combined them with their own genius for carving stone. Created those breathtaking facades. The South Arabian alphabet, used to record trade in frankincense, traveled north. It evolved. It influenced the scripts that would later write Aramaic and Hebrew. Even religious concepts moved with the caravans. The idea of a single, supreme deity, nurtured in the desert, began to filter into the polytheistic world of the Mediterranean. The route built for profit and power became a slender thread, stitching together distant worldviews. Maybe the most vivid example is from the edges of the Greek world. The colonization of the Black Sea coast was a resource grab. A desperate need for grain and metals pushed Greek settlers into Scythian territory. Relations were tense, often violent, yet in this zone of friction, something magnificent emerged. Scythian goldsmiths, renowned for their animal-style art, began to work for Greek clients. The result was a breathtaking fusion. A Greek wine vessel, a rhyton, would be shaped into a griffin's head, but the griffin's features, its coiled energy, were pure Scythian. These objects found in royal burials aren't purely Greek or purely Scythian. They're a third new thing, born from economic necessity and cultural collision. They're the physical evidence of a conversation that happened not with words but with gold and artistry. And of course, the Roman war machine, in its relentless search for metals and grain and manpower, imposed a brutal unity. But within that unity, a shared space was forged. Roman law, a system designed to administer an empire, provided a common framework for justice from Britain to Syria. Roman engineering, the roads, aqueducts, harbors built to move legions also connected communities, improved lives for centuries after the empire fell. Latin, the language of the legions and the tax collector, evolved into the Romance languages, left a deep linguistic imprint across Europe. The very violence that subjugated nations also forced them into a sustained dialogue. For good and ill, that shaped the foundation of Western civilization. So we're left with a difficult dual inheritance. The ancient scramble for rare resources was a source of immense suffering. Exploitation, repeated devastation. To ignore that is to sanitize history. Yet, it's also the tangled root system of our interconnected world. These conflicts were the brutal, unwilling midwives of cultural exchange. They forced innovation, they spread technologies from the stirrup to the alphabet, they mixed artistic traditions and gave us some of humanity's most stunning artifacts. The tapestry of global culture is woven with threads of conflict and commerce, dyed in the colors of both ambition and adaptation. To understand it, you have to hold two truths at once. Acknowledge the profound cost and recognize the paradoxical, unexpected beauty that grew stubbornly in the broken ground. The stories are compelling. But the proof is at the bottom of the sea. There's a shipwreck off the coast of Uluburun in Turkey. From the late Bronze Age, it sank, and for 3,000 years it was down there in the dark. When archaeologists found it, they brought it up, and it was more than a wreck. It was a time capsule, a manifest, 10 tons of copper ingots, a full ton of tin. That's the exact ratio you need to make bronze on a massive scale. And then there was everything else: ebony logs, discs of blue glass, elephant tusks, golden jewelry, even a scarab, a single scarab with the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. This wasn't some merchant ship, this was a floating treasury. A state mission carrying the ingredients for military power. Its loss would have been a catastrophe for its owners and for the kingdom waiting for it. One storm could do that: trigger a diplomatic incident, create a local bronze shortage, maybe even a desperate raid to replace what was lost. The wreck is a frozen moment. High-stakes commerce, a snapshot of a fragile network connecting empires. On land, the evidence is buried, intentionally. Across Europe, from Britain to the Baltic, they find these things. Founders' hoards, they're not collections of treasure, they're caches of broken things, shattered swords, bent axes, crumpled jewelry, all buried together carefully. These were the ancient scrapyards. Bronze was too valuable to waste, so when danger came, an invasion, a raid, people would gather their broken bronze. Bury it, plan to come back later, melt it all down and recast it into new tools, new weapons. The fact that so many of these hoards appear from certain periods, that tells you something. It speaks of widespread fear, communities under threat, hiding their most vital recyclable material. It points directly to times of conflict, times of metal shortage, where the ability to reforge a weapon could mean survival or collapse. You can see the anxiety built into the landscape, the cyclopean walls of Mycenaean. Stones so massive, later Greeks thought only giants could lift them, or the gates of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, built into a mountainside. These weren't just palaces. They were fortified storehouses. Their main job was to protect the wealth inside, the stockpiles of grain, the ingots of metal, the workshops. They were built to control access, to control the fertile valleys, the mining districts around them. Power concentrated in these defensible nodes, specifically to guard the resources that created that power. Every stone in those walls is a statement about the value of what was inside and the constant threat from outside. Even the small things tell this story. A broken piece of pottery, it seems insignificant, but its clay has a chemical signature, a fingerprint of where it was made. Scientists can trace that. Map a pot's journey from its workshop to where it was found. They can map ancient trade routes that way. Same with a bronze arrowhead. Its composition can show where the copper was mined, where the tin came from. And then, in certain layers of an archaeological dig, that flow of goods just stops. A pottery style that was common for centuries disappears. Imports vanish. Local production gets crude, insular. Those are the material fingerprints of war, of a trade route severed by conflict, a community cut off from the wider world, forced to rely only on itself. This evidence does something. It grounds the big narratives, the stories of heroes and empires. It grounds them in the dirt and in the deep. It confirms that the mythological quests, the historical wars, they were fought over real things. Heavy things, the stakes weren't abstract, they weren't just glory or honor, they were shiploads of metal, granaries full of wheat, control of a mountain pass. Archaeology shows you the material weight of ancient geopolitics, a world where the rise of a city, the fall of a kingdom, could hinge on securing a single cargo, or losing a critical mine. And when you see that how tightly a civilization's fate was tied to these physical threads, it leads to a question, an inevitable one. What happens when those threads begin to snap all at once? The systems that built empires, they ended up burying them. Civilizations got trapped by their own dependencies. It's this grand, tragic pattern. A society rises by mastering some rare resource. It weaves these complex trade networks to sustain itself, and then its survival depends on that fragile, far-flung web. When the web tears, everything unravels fast. Take the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. It was like a historical earthquake. The Hittite Empire vanished. The Mycenaean palaces went silent. Egypt held on, but its power was broken. For centuries, that was a mystery. Now, many historians see it as a cascade. The international system, moving tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, it was a house of cards. It only needed a few cards to fall. Maybe piracy by the sea peoples cut the sea lanes. Or invasions disrupted the overland routes. Suddenly, kingdoms couldn't make bronze. Their economies, their militaries were built on that alloy. Without it, the foundation crumbled. The collapse wasn't barbarians overwhelming strong states. It was strong states made brittle by their own intricate dependencies, shattering. On a smaller scale, there's Easter Island. In the middle of the Pacific, the Rapa Nui built those iconic stone statues, the moai. To move them, they needed strong ropes and sturdy sledges that required large trees. Over generations, the demand for timber cleared the entire island. The consequences were devastating. Without trees, the soil eroded. They couldn't build canoes for deep-sea fishing. Society fractured into conflict over the dwindling resources left. The very cultural drive that defined them erecting those statues consumed the environmental base that supported their civilization. They literally chopped down their own future. Even Rome wasn't immune. The empire's vast silver mines, like in Spain, funded its expansion and paid its legions. But mines are finite. The richest veins ran out. Production costs soared while output fell. That led to financial crises, currency debasement, inflation. It slowly bled the empire's economic strength. The state built its colossal apparatus on a resource stream that couldn't last. When it dwindled, the whole structure grew unstable. Ancient thinkers sensed this. Plato, in the 4th century BC, looked at the hills around Athens. He described them as the bare bones of a wasted body. He remembered a time when those hills had rich soil and dense forests. The deforestation caused erosion, the loss of fertile land. He linked that environmental degradation to societal decay. The land couldn't support the people like it once did, an early observation of sustainability, so the pattern is sobering. Ancient states anchored their power to finite resources and vulnerable trade links. They sowed the seeds of their own destruction. Their greatest strength became their ultimate fragility. It teaches that no civilization operates in a vacuum. It's part of an ecological and economic system. When that system is pushed too far, when consumption outpaces renewal, the pillars of society can turn to dust. This ancient echo isn't just history. It asks a question for our own interconnected, resource-hungry world. How do you build a legacy that endures instead of one that consumes its own foundations? The same pattern of conflict and collapse, it shows up in our oldest stories. The great myths from all over the world, they keep telling us the same thing about wanting what's rare. They're not just stories, they're a kind of ancient psychology, a way for people to work through the pressure of scarcity, the weight of desire. And if you put these tales next to each other, the similarities are hard to miss. They show a shared script written with gods and monsters about the resources that really mattered. Take the heroic quest. In Greek legend, Jason and the Argonauts sail to the edge of the world. There, after the Golden Fleece, a symbol of kingship guarded by a dragon. It's a state-funded mission for a critical asset. Then you go to ancient Ireland. Their great epic, the Táin, it's about a different kind of wealth. The prize is the brown bull of Cooley, a supernatural animal. The whole war starts because Queen Medb has to have this bull to match her husband's wealth. Cattle were the economy walking around, so both stories, one about a fleece, one about a bull, they're about a dangerous journey to seize a unique resource. The object changes with what the culture valued most, but the skeleton of the story is the same. A leader wants a rare thing. Heroes face danger to get it. Their success or failure decides a kingdom's fate. This mythological logic applies to the land itself, the source of the wealth. In Mesopotamia, the god Ninurta fights a monster named Asag, a creature of stone and chaos. Ninurta's victory, it's more than order winning. It has a material result. His defeat of the stone monster makes the rivers flow with precious stones and minerals. The myth explains valuable resources as the direct outcome of a divine fight. Then look to the Andes, home of the Inca. They saw the mountain peaks as powerful gods called Apus. These Apus weren't just passive giants. They were living beings who controlled the weather, the water, and the mineral wealth inside their stone bodies. Mining wasn't simple extraction. It was a negotiation with a sacred entity. You had to offer respect and rituals to the Apu to safely take the silver or gold it held. In both traditions, the valuable materials of the earth aren't inert. They're guarded by a supernatural force. Getting them requires sacred combat or careful diplomacy. Maybe the most universal symbol is the treasure-hoarding dragon. From the Norse saga where Sigurd slays the dragon Fafnir for a cursed gold hoard, to St. George defeating a dragon to free a kingdom, the motif is everywhere. A fearsome serpentine creature lies in a cave or on a mountain, sitting on a pile of gold. It doesn't use the wealth. It just guards it, keeping it from the community. This is a perfect mythological representation of harsh realities. It can symbolize the danger of mining. Going into the dragon's dark cave is like going into a deadly mine shaft. It can represent a hostile kingdom that monopolizes a vital trade route, hoarding the wealth. The dragon is the ultimate obstacle, the personification of all the risk and conflict around concentrated wealth. The hero who slays it doesn't just win a battle, he liberates an economic lifeline. These aren't coincidences, they're evidence of a shared human experience. From Central Asia to the highlands of Peru, societies that never knew each other arrived at the same narrative solutions for the same pressures, the anxiety over scarce resources. The peril of the quest to secure them, the need to justify the violence of acquisition by calling it a heroic struggle. The stories provided a framework to make sense of a competitive world. They turned the messy economics of tin and cattle and gold into epic dramas of destiny. This global tapestry of myth tells us something. Long before globalization connected our markets, it was our common challenges that connected our imaginations. We all dreamed of dragons because we all feared the same scarcities, and we all dreamed of heroes because we all hoped for a way to secure our survival. Our words carry traces of those old wars. We're still using the language of those ancient physical struggles every day, usually without even noticing. Salary, that word comes from the Latin salarium. That was the special allowance for Roman soldiers. Not for weapons or armor, but for salt. Their pay was literally measured in the mineral that preserved their food, that kept them alive on the march. To be worth your salt, we still say that. It means you're capable, you're valuable. The origin is stark. In the slave markets of Rome, a healthy, strong enslaved person was literally worth more salt. The phrase preserves that direct equation between a person's labor and a vital mineral. Our financial language is built on this. Pecuniary, meaning related to money, comes from pecus, the Latin word for cattle. In early herding societies, your wealth walked on 4 legs. Your herd was your bank account, your standing. Even the concept of capital has roots in caput, Latin for head, as in head of cattle. So when we talk about capital today, in a linguistic sense, we're still counting livestock. These aren't just odd origins, they're cultural memories. They show that our most abstract ideas about value and exchange started out grounded in the physical, contested resources of the ancient world. Symbols tell the same story. Heraldry, coats of arms, that's a visual language of power from the Middle Ages, but its grammar comes from antiquity. A golden lion rampant wasn't just decoration. It symbolized courage, but also kingship, control over gold mines. The eagle, adopted by Rome, by Byzantium, by later empires, it meant supreme vision, dominance over vast territory. A castle or a tower on a shield didn't just mean a home. It signaled fortified wealth, control over a strategic point on a trade route or a mining district. These weren't random pictures, they were boasts, declarations of what a family or a kingdom possessed and what they could protect. Mythology gave us symbols that define strategy itself. The Golden Fleece from Jason's quest, it's entered our language as the ultimate prize, a nearly impossible goal. It captures the essence of an ancient resource mission, a distant, legendary object guarded by danger, requiring a team and great risk to acquire. Even more profound is the idea of an Achilles heel. In the story, the great hero was invulnerable except for one spot. That's become our universal metaphor for a fatal flaw, a critical weakness in an otherwise strong system. For an ancient civilization, that heel was often a single, fragile supply line, the tin route from Afghanistan, the incense trail through the desert. The grain shipments from the Black Sea, the whole society's strength depended on that one artery staying open. If an enemy found it and cut it, the entire heroic structure could collapse. The myth gave a personal, dramatic shape to a geopolitical truth. This legacy in language and symbol is a kind of fossil record. It's evidence that the economics of ancient conflict didn't just shape borders and battles. It shaped how we think. It wired our minds to understand value in terms of salt and cattle, to see risk as a dragon guarding a horde, to see power as a lion on a field of gold. We've internalized the logic of that old world. When we call a difficult goal a holy grail, we're invoking another quest for a sacred, life-giving object. When we describe a crucial weakness, we instinctively reach for the story of Achilles. That proves the scramble for rare resources was more than a historical phase. It was a formative experience for human civilization. It built the conceptual frameworks we still use to navigate a world of scarcity, desire, and power. And if these old patterns are so deep in us, it makes you wonder what unseen forces they might still be driving in the conflicts of today. The scramble for tin never really ended. It just got a new name. Now we talk about rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, the things that run our phones, electric cars, satellites, and the map it creates looks very familiar. One country, China, processes most of the world's rare earths right now. That control is a kind of leverage, a modern monopoly. It echoes older ones like the Hittites guarding iron or the Nabateans on the incense routes. Then there's lithium for batteries. That search is pushing companies and countries into fragile places, creating new partnerships. It's like the amber trade once linking Baltic tribes to kings far south. The choke points have changed too. They're not mountain passes anymore. They're undersea cables, shipping lanes, the Strait of Hormuz where so much oil moves. Securing those routes, that's today's version of guarding the Amber Road. And there's that same painful paradox, the resource curse. A country with huge mineral wealth often ends up with conflict, corruption, instability. That treasure becomes a target. This isn't new. Think of Lydia, rich in gold, or the incense kingdoms of Arabia. They were always targets for invasion. Their wealth didn't mean safety. It meant every ambitious neighbor was watching. The very thing that promised prosperity could also cause its collapse. You see that in the ruins of ancient cities that grew too wealthy to defend. Then there's the cost, the human and environmental cost, the huge open pits for copper and lithium. The tailings ponds, rivers diverted. It recalls Cyprus stripped of forests for bronze, or Roman mountainsides carved away for gold. And the questions about mining labor, then and now, they remind us. The foundation of a technological age, whether it's bronze or silicon, is often dug out at a deep cost. These aren't just modern issues, they're ancient patterns. Just playing out on a bigger scale. That's why the old stories matter. They're not just relics, they're a lens, a way to see the grammar underneath today's news. Take the Bronze Age collapse. It was triggered by broken tin networks. That gives us perspective on our own fragile, specialized supply chains. Or the Trojan War, a conflict over a trade route. That helps us think about tensions in places like the South China Sea. The patterns are constant. Alliances, monopolies, conflict over scarce materials. The actors change, the technology changes, but the core drama stays. It's this desperate, often violent pursuit of what the world needs and can't easily get. Seeing these cycles, that's the first step. Maybe then we can ask if a different ending is possible. A civilization's survival could justify a lot, but there was a line somewhere. The ancient world wasn't empty of morality. Even while empires fought wars for tin and incense, their own thinkers were wrestling with the cost. They were asking the same questions we ask. Did securing vital materials for your people make conquest right? Could enslaving miners, clearing forests, subjugating tribes, could any of that be balanced by the stability it brought back home? Across cultures, philosophers and prophets gave answers, and many of those answers were warnings. In ancient Greece, there was the concept of pleonexia. An insatiable greed, wanting more than your share. The playwright Aeschylus made this a central theme. He showed how the pursuit of excessive wealth and power, often seized from others, led to hubris, a fatal arrogance. And hubris always invited nemesis, a divine retribution. The fall of a king in those plays wasn't just bad luck. It was the inevitable collapse that followed overreaching. The message for Athens, itself an imperial power, was clear. That relentless drive to acquire could unravel everything you built. Far to the east, in India, the critique was even more direct. The teachings of Buddhism and Jainism, emerging around the 6th century BC, challenged the resource-hungry model of state power. They advocated ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings. This wasn't just personal conduct. It was a philosophical rejection of the violence in conquest and extraction. Jain monks would sweep the path before them to avoid harming insects. That extreme care stood in stark contrast to empires moving mountains for gold. Both traditions taught that true fulfillment came from minimizing desire, not endlessly satisfying it. They offered an ancient alternative to the cycle of consumption and conflict. The voices of conscience spoke in the Levant too. The Hebrew prophets, figures like Amos and Isaiah, condemned not wealth itself, but the oppression that came with it. They railed against kings in Israel and Judah who built luxurious palaces through forced labor, who cheated the poor for more land and silver. Their target was the injustice woven into the economic system. They framed this not as bad policy, but as a violation of a covenant. A society that grew rich by crushing others had lost its soul, and it would face judgment. These traditions show something crucial. The ancient world wasn't unanimously for expansion at any cost. Within these cultures, often at their heights, there were serious ethical debates. Voices arguing that a civilization's greatness should be measured by its justice, not its stockpiles. That security gained through the suffering of others was a fragile security. A cursed one. They saw the moral corrosion that set in when a society defined its needs too broadly and its obligations to outsiders too narrowly. Listening to these warnings today isn't academic. It's a mirror. It challenges us to apply the same scrutiny to our own systems. When we trace the cobalt in a battery back to its source, what stories do we find? Are we, like the audiences of Aeschylus, confident our pleonexia is immune to consequence? These philosophies urging restraint, condemning violence thousands of years ago, they sound less like relics now. More like urgent, forgotten wisdom. They ask us what true necessity is and what is merely desire dressed in the clothes of need. That reflection turns history inward. It makes it not just a story about them, but a question about us. Look at the screen you're watching this on. It has a piece of the ancient story inside it. There are elements in there: neodymium, tantalum, cobalt. They're like the tin of our era, mined from the earth, often in distant places under difficult conditions. These are the rare materials that let our modern world work. The journey of that cobalt from a deep pit in the Democratic Republic of Congo to the battery in your hand, that's a supply chain of staggering complexity. And sometimes hardship. It's a new chapter in the oldest book, a civilization looking for a critical resource from the edges of its map. Now think about your morning. That cup of coffee or tea. For centuries, those weren't staples. They were luxuries as exclusive as frankincense. Coffee beans traveled from the highlands of Ethiopia and Yemen, along trade routes that fueled empires. That sparked colonial wars. The British tea trade was so vital it led to conflicts. It shaped foreign policy for generations. That warm drink in your mug is the end point of a historical drama. About taste and addiction and control. You're sipping on the legacy of a resource conflict, or consider the energy that moves you. If you drive a car, the gasoline in the tank is the lifeblood of a modern geopolitical landscape. It's replaced incense as the fragrant, volatile substance nations form alliances over. The substance they wage proxy wars over, controlling oil fields, controlling shipping lanes. It dictates global power. In a way that would feel deeply familiar to a Nabatean caravan master or a Roman general. The map has changed, but the principle is identical, controlling a vital flow. You are not separate from this history. You're living inside its latest iteration. Every choice as a consumer, every device you use, every meal you eat, it connects you to a web. A web of extraction and exchange that spans the globe and reaches back millennia. The cotton in your shirt, the aluminum in your car, the lithium in a rechargeable battery. Each one has a hidden biography of discovery, conflict, transport. We are all active participants in a system of resource dependence. Our comfort, our communication, our mobility, they're made possible by the same relentless logic. The logic that sent Bronze Age ships searching for tin, that sent Roman legions marching for Spanish silver. This realization isn't meant to induce guilt. It's to foster a connection, a profound one. It asks for a new awareness, a mindful consumption. When you hold your phone, you're holding a condensed history of human ingenuity and struggle over the elements of the earth. You become a link in a chain that stretches back to the first miner who chipped a piece of copper from a rock and saw possibility. Understanding this lineage is the first step toward honoring it. It lets us ask better questions about where things come from, about what true cost means. It transforms history from a distant record into a living force, one that flows through your hands every single day. and it begs the final question, the most personal one. In a world still shaped by these ancient hungers, what kind of participant do you choose to be? The romantic stories are strong. They can hide what was really happening underneath. To see the ancient world clearly, you have to pull the myth away from the material facts. Take the Trojan War, that huge conflict Homer wrote about. For a long time, it was seen as a 10-year siege over a queen. But if you look at the map, Troy's position was everything. It controlled the Dardanelles Strait. That was the choke point. Black Sea grain and metals from the Caucasus had to pass through there to reach the Greek world. So the war was probably about breaking a rival's hold on that trade. The story says the ships were launched for a face, but the real prize was the cargo those ships were meant to secure. Then there's El Dorado, that legend of a golden city. It drove the Spanish conquistadors. The reality was a ritual. For the Muisca people in the Andes, when a new leader took power, they'd cover him in gold dust. He'd be rowed to the center of a sacred lake and wash the gold off into the water. It was an act of balance, giving the gold back, but the Spanish chroniclers, they had their own obsession with gold. They took that ceremony and turned it into a story about a city made of gold. That mistake, that greed, fueled centuries of searching and conflict over something that wasn't there. Even the Silk Road, the name makes you think of luxury fabric, but that name came much later. For the people using those routes, silk was just one part of it. What moved in bigger amounts and with more impact were horses from the steppes, jade for rituals, bulk spices for keeping food and medicine. Armies were built on those horses. Empires used that jade to show their power. The road was a practical line for survival and control, not just a path for expensive cloth and the Dark Ages. That label makes it sound like everything went dark after Rome fell. But if you look at resources, it looks different. It wasn't a loss of light, it was a shift. The big, centralized Roman networks broke apart. The supply chains for Spanish silver, for Egyptian grain, they shattered. So people had to rely on what was close by. Local lords controlled local iron mines, local fields. Innovation didn't end. It just turned to meet immediate local needs. It was a painful recalibration. A system that had been global broke down, and everything had to adjust on a smaller scale. Pulling back these romantic layers doesn't make the past less compelling. It makes it more human. You see people not as characters in a fable, but as practical participants in a competitive world. They made calculations. They secured advantages. They fought for control of the things that meant security for their people, not for some abstract glory. Seeing this economic reality lets you appreciate what they actually achieved. The logistics, the diplomacy, the engineering, and their failures weren't moral lessons. They were strategic mistakes in a high-stakes game. This grounded view gives you something more useful than a legend. It gives you a mirror. You can see the patterns that still quietly steer things. The story never ended. It just put on different clothes. The Bronze Age needed tin. The digital age needs rare earths. It's the same thread running through everything. Our need for what's rare, what's valuable. We saw how myths weren't just stories. They were powerful narratives. They dressed up economic needs as divine quests, as heroic glory. Geography became destiny, a single mountain pass, a narrow strait. These things decided the fate of empires for centuries. The pursuit of resources forged new technologies. It built social hierarchies. It created colossal empires. And then we saw some of those empires consume themselves. These echoes aren't silent. They're in the words we use: salary, capital. They're etched into our political borders. Borders drawn by forgotten wars over salt marshes, over silver veins. They hum beneath our current tensions. The logic today controlling choke points, securing critical minerals, it feels familiar. The philosopher George Santayana had a warning. Those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This isn't about memorizing dates, it's about seeing patterns. The ancient scramble shows a rhythm of human civilization, need, innovation, competition, consequence. Understanding these roots gives us more than knowledge of the past. It gives us a lens for the present, a way to see the underlying architecture of our world, to ask better questions. Where do things come from? What does true cost mean? It turns history from a distant record into a living dialogue, a dialogue that asks us to consider our own role, our role in this ongoing story.